Okay, now you guys know one of the classics, that other bread and butter, is the Global Elite book series, and we've done many of these. I really want to do Changing Images of Man, but it's just so you can't find a physical copy of it. Now, I think the last Global Elite book series that we were touching on and tackling was actually, we could include sex espionage in that. Even though it's not written by a global elite man, it's written by just a normal historian. We finished this last night, and the part 2 went out to all the subscribers. So, yes, I did finally finish this. I know it took a while. So if you're over on Rockfin, it's right here. Part 2 just went up, and we delved deep into the history of how the elites control us through these types of operations. We will also do the second analysis of this classic, which is the same topic, but much more recent, with Jeff Stein McGeffrey. And prior to those, the last Global Elite text that we had done was something in the vein of really a continuation to Quigley, which was the Johann Ratio book, The Milner-Fabian Conspiracy, hence why Fabian Freeway will fit very well with those texts. Now, we mentioned that Jacques Attali is an important figure in the previous talk where we covered his book, Brief History of the Future. That was one of our early Global Elite text lectures in this series, which is a never-ending series. There's always more writings of the elite to analyze, to decode, and to display before this lovely audience. By the way, if you would like and share, where is everybody? What? There's nothing else to do. You need to be here doing this. Okay, we need to be understanding how the system operates. So you better get your butt over here, sit down, get out your pen and paper, get take notes. This is the first half of a lecture. Somebody said the other day, do Jacques Attali's first American translated globalist book called Millennium. And I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. Well, I went and looked it up, and it's a very readable, accessible little text. And what do we know? We got another global elite man up here giving a blurb. Alvin Toffler. It's an unsettling, exhilarating, scintillating work. Attali is always there to teach us with crackling creative intelligence. Crackling? How does creative intelligence crackle? I don't know what that means, but it's an odd choice of words. But and then we got Arthur Schlesinger. Attali's Millennium is a fertile speculation of the things to come. And it's called, in its subtitle, Winners and Losers. Looters. That's more accurate, right? IMF looters. Winners and IMF looters in the coming world order. Now, wait a minute. Remember, for decades, there was no such thing as that. There ain't no NWO. And yet, the global elite people were writing books about the coming of, what does that say? Oh, I don't know what that meant. I don't know what that means. It doesn't exist. Even though I see it in front of my face, it must not exist because the authority system and the authority structure that exists has told me it doesn't exist. Even though I'm reading right here that it does exist right in front of my face. But now this book came out in 1991. So we are, 15 years prior to the famous Brief History of the Future book that we reviewed many years ago, 6-7 years ago, when we were beginning this series. Of course, this series began with Dr. Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. We did Anglo-American Establishment. Soon after, we did Marilyn Ferguson's Aquarian Conspiracy, which is not a conspiracy book. Then we did Jacques Attali's Brief History of the Future from 2006. Well, it turns out Jacques, who again is the Kissinger of France, Jacques Attali, Jacques, a monkey, imagine. The Kissinger of France wrote an earlier book way ahead in its predictions. In fact, if you recall, he made the prediction of nomadic devices, which he said these devices of the future would allow us to be cut off, deracinated from our traditional structures of family, nation state, etc. And Attali was absolutely correct. He said the effect of consumerism would be, as it was mass produced, these devices, laptops, TVs, and especially these, would allow us to become more mobile and no longer be attached to the things that formerly rooted us as human beings. Hence, he titled them nomadic devices. Now, I didn't know that he hadn't just said that in 2006. He said it in his 1991 book, Millennium. Wow. So even more ahead of the curve than we expected. And there's some interesting artwork. I don't know who chose the artwork. If you publish a book, typically, right, it's not the author that chooses the artwork. So a lot of times people like have these conspiracies and these, oh, why did you put this on the cover of your book? Dude, I didn't choose the cover of my book. Okay, and most people who have a publisher, they don't get to choose the cover of their book. I had nothing to do with the cover of this book at all. That's what publishers and editors do. For Attali, though, there is this bizarre, I can't even read this, it's so small. It looks like the months, or is it maybe I think it's the months. 12. It's 12. So he's got these weird drawings and look like etchings and woodcuts. Right. Now remember, Attali was the Kissinger to Francois Mitterrand. Okay, so we're talking about the power behind the throne, so to speak. Again, the Kissinger of France. And he is identified that as that by Toffler in the foreword. Okay, so that's not conspiracy theorizing. It's actually right here. He says, Attali, now this is 1991. Attali is not known in America. America's too provincial. Oh yeah, we're not sophisticated and European. In fact, it was Jacques Attali who accompanied Francois Mitterrand in the global meetings with Gorbachev. And it was because of this Kissinger of France role that Toffler says Attali was placed as the head of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And he says that he is there to help Eastern Europe undergo the painful transition from a centrally planned Soviet economy to a market-based one. However, he's not well known in America because Americans are provincial. He says that Attali is a force of intellect, and his interests and his analyses are broad and wide-ranging. In fact, Toffler says he wrote a fascinating treatise on the connection between politics and the economics of music. How does music relate to political culture? Well, you're gonna find and you're gonna see some interesting comments from Attali, which I think help us to understand why. In fact, you will even see a couple esoteric references from Attali, which makes sense given what we read in Brief History of the Future, where he talks about the global brain when we're all linked in our minds to the web, which he calls the golem. And he says that, in fact, Attali could be the head of a bank which could become a new pillar of the global order. Now, this is right at the beginning of the public announcement of the EU, right? When was the EU publicly announced? Wasn't it like early 90s? EU. Now, we know from our writings in our 93. Okay, so this is 2 years before the public announcement of the EU. However, the EU was already planned by the OSS and the post-World War II powers in the 40s and 50s. And in fact, we know that that was the case through the what's called the European Project. And we went into great detail in Ratu's excellent geopolitical absolute masterpiece, Necessary Work, the Milner-Fabian conspiracy, and he's got an entire chapter dedicated to all the goons and goblins behind the European project, and essentially the Fabian socialists who were the architects of it. And yet again, here we have something that is not new in the 1990s, but even in this book, they're essentially saying that he might be the head of the biggest bank going forward. Of course, that didn't actually materialize because there's two areas of this book's thesis which ended up being wrong. So notice that the global elites, when they write these kinds of books, they don't always get everything right. They project things into the future. They have theories, plans, analysis, actuaries, etc. And they're not always 100% correct. And we're going to notice two key points where Attali got things wrong, but we're also going to see a lot of places where he got things really correct. Interesting. Again, the woodcuts. I don't know what the woodcuts mean. It's another bizarre woodcut of, like, almost look kind of alchemical. This is like an angel man handing a book, and then an angel above the angel who's blessing the people. I can't tell what this means. You can figure out what this means, but. So Attali begins by saying that, well, we're entering a new era because the Berlin Wall has fallen. So this book is written right around that time. It's just fallen. And he says, Toffler's future shock, that's old news. Change is the only constant. That's not actually true. In fact, if change is the only constant, you couldn't say change is the only constant because the proposition itself would be self-refuting and would no longer be true. So if change is the only constant, yeah, thank you, by the way. We got 800 people on X. That's cool. You guys would hit like and share. We got 400 over here on YouTube. That's nice. Attali says that history is accelerating. The Berlin Wall has fallen. Now we're in a new order, an NWO. So key elements here that will be admitted is that it's almost like, as Attali will point out later, he says that the balance of powers in the world during the Cold War were two pillars with a pyramid in the middle. Yes, he says this. I kid you not. He says the two pillars are USSR and USSA, and then the pyramid in the middle. And he says that now that the Cold War has come to an end, the Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet Union is collapsing. He says that this pillar over here of the USSR is gone. Now we have, and he says the pyramid, by the way, is the U.S. with the dollar at the top. So the end of the USSR removes the balance of power, so to speak, to the new liberal open market order of pluralism. But before we get to all that, fascinating statement at the very beginning of the book I did not expect. Attali says, you might think that if you want to understand today's world, you would want to read classics of economics and geopolitics like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or Karl Marx's Das Kapital. And why, yes, wouldn't every sophisticated nerd man, geopolitical nerd man, I read all the books, Karl Marx, and he says, those aren't even as relevant as Blade Runner. Yes, you heard me right. Jacques Attali says Blade Runner is more relevant today than Das Kapital or Wealth of Nations. Look at that. Interesting. It's almost like he's thinking esoteric Hollywood wise, like he's thinking in this kind of way, yeah. Exactly. By the way, shout out to those super chatters. I love my new sounds here. Look at this. There we go. He says Blade Runner is going to be more accurate because the future that we're going into will be technocratic. 1991, y'all. This wasn't written in 2024. So again, a lot of things he's going to get right, particularly with tech predictions. And in fact, believe it or not, Jacques Attali is actually going to get quite a few geopolitical things and analyses correct. The question, though, is that in critiques, he's going to get some really accurate critiques, believe it or not. I was surprised. That does not mean his answers are correct. Now he says that, look, if the U.S. is going to go into the future, if it's going to be the center of global power in the future, he says it's going to have to transform. And one of the things it's going to have to transform is that money will have to move at the speed of the future. And he doesn't know if the dollar and these kinds of things are going to be able to move at the speed that globalization will require. That's fascinating because he wasn't even thinking of Bitcoin. He wasn't even thinking of cryptocurrencies. And of course, it's Silicon Valley, America. It's the West that develops Bitcoin. And by the way, Bitcoin will actually answer a lot of the things that Attali brings up as problems. So again, 1991, he didn't have any knowledge of this. He says that the future people will be severed from any national alliance by the microchip gadgets that they have. These nomadic devices will make some people into rich nomads. They will be able to participate in a global liberal market culture through economic choice. They will be able to roam the planet seeking ways to use their free time. Not everybody will participate in this, however. There will be many in the future who become obsolete. Their functions are obsolete. There will be beggars of the future, the poor nomads, boat people on a planetary scale, plying the planet searching for sustenance and shelter. It's almost as if they planned global upheaval to move the populations and to make them into nomads in order to have the end of the nation state. In other words, the open market liberal order post-Soviet Union is the means by which there will be the transformation away from the nation state. And he says that you can read Alvin Toffler about this. And he says, I'm saying basically the same thing. Like past civilizations, they sought order to ward off the threat of nature and other warring tribes and men. This coming new order of the future will be based on the ability to manage violence. Unlike previous orders, however, they were ruled by religion in the past, then it transitioned to military force. The new order of the future will manage all violence largely by economic control. In other words, microchips, devices, etc. And if we want to avoid that, CBDC, UBI, etc., we're going to need to have the means in this electronic age of opposing the electronic centralized control. This is the only one that does that. Bitcoin. It's decentralized. And by the way, are you having a good week? Many of us are having good weeks. In 5 days, Bitcoin is up 5%. Now, okay, guys, clicking the button. What did Ivan say? There's a good chance that we pop to 80 or 90. Okay, 70 was a big key resistance point. If we can edge above 70, there's a good chance of popping to 80 or 90. Not guaranteed, but again, we know we're going to 150 eventually. Okay, it might be this year, it might be next year, who knows? But look, I just heard today that the pension funds, the boomer pension funds, are now looking for Bitcoin exposure.